Well, welcome to my panelists. And so you're going to set the frame for the next couple of days. I'm expecting big provocations from you. Our topic is really the race to net zero as we think about this. Of course, we know that the firing gun has been shot more than once, most recently perhaps at the COP meeting, the climate summit in Dubai that took place in November, where there was an agreement among the countries after much controversy and contention that we should move away in an orderly and just fashion away from fossil fuels, as well as a number of other objectives that were agreed. But there's a huge question about who pays for it, how is it paid for, in what sequence. Maybe, Ari, I can turn to you first. Give us your thoughts on, as you think about the race to net zero, how should we think about what's been called a huge financing gap?
Yeah, so maybe just to contextualize first, basically there is a need of 4 trillion annually in order for the world to deliver the transition to net zero. And this is only about talking about climate. As Andrea talked a lot about nature, layering nature on top of that is another about 1.5 trillion of investment that's needed every year in order to safeguard nature. So
although there are co-benefits from dealing with the carbon and nature, of course, helps other aspects.
They're interdependent, but we're talking really big numbers. We have quite a lot of the technologies, changes in processes that we're going to need to get to the transition. However, a lot of the technologies are still nascent. And that is what is creating the financing gap. And the question that's asked a lot is there's a lot of money on one hand, and there's technologies that need the money to scale up, and that money isn't flowing. That's because a lot of the financial institutions, for example, I work with a lot of financial institutions, a lot of these investments are not yet bankable and don't present the right risk return for banks in order to invest. And that's creating that bottleneck, which we have to unlock now in the next 5 to 10 years. Because if the capital isn't flowing in the right technologies, then those technologies are never going to scale and they're never going to become bankable. And the other dimension is what we call the just transition, which is there is a gap between developed countries and the countries that are developing and need cheap energy, basically, in order to develop. And so there's a lot of talk about, financial institutions saying, stop financing fossil fuels, which is absolutely the right thing to do, but we have to do it, as you said, in an orderly transition to make sure that the developing economies are also ticking along and not damaging those economies in the way to net zero.
So you've identified that financing gap. Do you have any creative solution for this? Where will this money come from? My personal view is, though we might like to wave a magic wand and have governments pay for all of this, it seems unlikely that the money is going to come from official coffers. The trillions, you're talking about 4 trillion plus the IEA has estimated by 2030 that's needed to go into some form of climate tech or clean energy. The IMF has warned that governments don't have much capacity, nor the multilateral institutions like the World Bank, to expand that lending much more. So there's only one other place it can come from, right?
Indeed. So I'd offer probably 2 thoughts here. One is the idea of catalytic capital. So thinking about where can we put capital very smartly in the key technologies in order to scale them up, to get them just to the stage where the private sector can come in at scale and finance these technologies. And that catalytic capital can be mobilized by a different number of different sources. And the second really important dimension here, which we've mentioned also yesterday, is collaboration. No one player, no one actor is going to be doing this alone. So the governments are not going to be able to do this alone, but also private sector. And so banks, asset managers, private investors, angel investors, together with governments, are going to have to come up with innovative forms of capital to put that capital in the right places to catalyze then scaling up those technologies. So it's not that 4 trillion isn't offering the right returns. It's just the first layer of that 4 trillion that needs to be financed, and then it will unlock the rest of it.
So let's see how we can get creative with some of these innovative financing mechanisms. Maybe, Nick, I'll come to you. As a chief executive of a company, you've thought about this from an operational perspective. You have to run a business, but as well think about some of these broader issues. What do you see when you look at the net zero race, as we're calling it, are some of the keys? Well,
I think fact number one, we've got to accelerate. I mean, I think that's a recognized fact. There's no doubt about that. But the good news is companies are starting to stand up and really take responsibility for that. So if you think about the need to drive reduction in carbon, twice as many companies last year applied for science-based targets. 1.5 degree pathway to net zero. The good news about that is to apply for targets and to get certification, you actually have to have the facts. You've got to do the work to start with to identify what your systemic impact is on the world in total, as the previous speaker mentioned. So we have to go through a very disciplined pathway to understand where our carbon usage is coming from. So if I look at our business, for instance, we're in the food industry. Okay, the food industry, end-to-end, farm to fork, 30% of the carbon emissions globally, 70% of the fresh water usage. But when I look at my carbon footprint as a company, 80% of it is in scope 3, not in scope 1, scope 2. So I need technology to reduce the amount of the carbon I use in my plants. And I can invest in that. And typically there's a good return on that as well if you do it well. But that's only 20% of my emissions. I need to understand the 80%. If I look at the 80%, half of it's in agriculture. So I have to focus my efforts on regenerative agriculture and going right the way back to the farmers and working with them in a way that makes farming more regenerative, but also makes it sustainable for the farmers. So can you make it economically attractive for them to be more carbon thoughtful in the way they produce? So to do that, you have to form new partnerships. And the fact that companies are thinking like that and thinking systemically gives me belief that we will see progress.
Talk a little bit more about the role of those partnerships. It sounds like that's an important theme. It's not always easy to work, even with your own supply chain. Obviously, if there's a profit pool or value, it can be shared very generously with your suppliers, or you can be a bit greedy and keep it for yourself. So there's financial considerations, but there's also cultural differences across different partnerships that you can work with. What are some of the challenges you're finding?
So you have to find different ways of partnering to create value for both sides. So I'll give you a couple of examples, two extremes. So both in agriculture. So our biggest raw material is corn. In the history of Tate Lyle, we farm over 1.4 million acres of corn in the US. Okay, to drive economic prosperity through that value chain and reduce carbon emissions, you have to look at big tech to help you. Using tech to identify what the impact of that farming is on the planet and finding better ways to do it. So going back 5-6 years, we formed a partnership with Jatera. They're the sustainability arm of Land O'Lakes in the US, and they provide the technology that allows farmers to look at their carbon impacts. And then using that data, we can use agronomists to help them reduce their impact. Things like cover crops, reducing water usage, soil leachage, use of fertilizers, etc. And that reduces the cost of farming, reduces the carbon impact, and is a win-win for us. Now, we did that through a partnership with Jatera because they've got the technology we don't. So that's one extreme. Then I go to the kind of developing world, smallholder farmers in China. Our second biggest crop is stevia. Okay, so we buy a lot of stevia leaf to create a low-calorie sweetener. To help replace sugar. But those farmers have no information at all. But giving them simple farming techniques through different partnerships. So we've partnered with Nanjing University and Earthwatch to look at sustainable farming of stevia in China. And simply by reducing fertilizer usage, they've increased their yields, they've increased their outputs, they've reduced their cost of farming, and their carbon load has come down by 65%. Now, that's a very different model, though, because you need people in smallholder farmers providing education versus the big tech model in the US. Right. So two extremes, but relevant for their particular system. And you have to be very nimble in how you manage that contrast.
Well, I'm feeling a little bit better. Both my coffee and my sweetener are getting more sustainable, right? We're off to a good start this morning. We chose the right partnership examples here. Maybe we can continue with you, James. Can you give us your sense? Obviously, you represent an association, but you also, your members have partnerships and coalitions that you work with. Can you give us your perspective as we think about the race to net zero as an energy provider or network of energy providers? How do you think about this challenge?
Thank you, Vijay. Well, first of all, I think it's important that we realize that this race to net zero, there is no one winner. There's no winner takes all. I think it's important as we look across the world that everybody gets across that finish line. And the reality is that the world is very, very different. If you look at the global south and the challenges faced by the global south, it's very different to the challenges faced by the global north. I love this idea of systemic thinking. I think far too often we look at the issue of sustainability through the lens of climate change only. So it's in a way, it's refreshing that we look at the social and the economic needs. And I think it's vital that all of these things are put together if we want to find a solution which works. I think we're making great progress. I'm actually quite positive about it. If we look specifically about the race to net zero, which is what this panel's about, we're making more investments. I mean, for instance, renewable electricity, in the next 5 years, we will put more renewable electricity into the world than we ever have since electricity was first produced. So that's a fantastic step forward. But also, the reality is that 3.7 million people die every year across the world because they don't have access to clean fuel. And 3.7 million people, that's more than the number of people who died of COVID in 2021. It's more than the number of people who die from HIV/AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis every year. And these are absolutely vital issues that I think the world needs to address. So, looking at numbers, and it's horrible to talk about numbers of deaths, but one of the things that drives us for climate change is the risk to societies now, but in the future. And the World Health Organization has said that right now, with the trajectory that we're on, between 2030 2050, we're looking at around 250,000 deaths a year, additional deaths coming from climate change. That's dreadful. We absolutely have to do something about it. But it does need to be put in the context of 3.7 million people who are dying right now because of lack of access to clean energy. So I would say energy poverty is an issue. There is no one size fits all. There is no one winner. We need a multi-tech approach. And I would say that that does require, for instance, the use of gas, which is the organization that I represent, to help overcome those challenges. It's going to resolve and avoid many of those premature deaths. So
the point you make about energy poverty, I think, is often overlooked, and I'm glad you did bring that up. Particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, in South Asia, where I come from, lack of energy access to modern fuels typically means it's women and girls who walk miles a day to get crop residue or agricultural residue, burn in imperfect cook stoves, which leads to indoor pollution, one of the leading killers. And like that, we have numerous examples of how the justice dimension of the energy transition gets forgotten. And so it's right to emphasize that. What the solution should be, we can have a longer debate than this panel on whether it's gas or other alternatives. But certainly, I think the issue should be acknowledged that this is a huge part of also what was agreed at the COP summit, that when we talked about a climate ambition, there was the word just as well. It's an orderly and just transition that was agreed. And I think that's the justice part of this, is to think about energy equity and equitable access to energy. But the point about how we balance these, right? And we started on the note of partnerships. How do we bring on board different actors who may be having different goals? We have a question, and I encourage all of you to use the Slido. We are watching the questions. I have access to them here. We had a question, perhaps it might be directed to you, Eric. I'm going to come in early because I promised my audience I will include them in this conversation. When you talk about financial services to support the bankable or insurable targets under emerging risks, how do organizations drive this? Do you think individuals could be included in the collaboration, as another of our participants? The financial sector is known to be quite elitist, so it would be interesting to hear about inclusion in finance.
Indeed.
So, some challenges to you on thinking about inclusion,
thank
but
you.
You can address that.
Thank you for the question. And actually, the transition to net zero is going to change a lot of things. I think that's one of the things that's going to have to change. When I talk to a lot of banks now, the first thing that they will recognize is that the transition will not be delivered by any one single actor. So they are looking for ways to collaborate across supply chains, across value chains. I mean, individuals, and we touched, I think Andrea touched on this quite a bit in his opening speech. which was individuals have a very big role to play. Where you put your savings is very important, and how you ask your bank to invest your money is very important. And then also consumer behavior is very important, because if people are willing to choose green products over brown products, even better, willing to pay a premium, that's going to create a pull from the supply chains. And then on the other side, on the supply side of capital, and I really love the examples on agriculture. There's a lot of pressure on large corporations to decarbonize, and that's very public, and they've got these big sustainability departments doing the numbers. But I think the vulnerability in the supply chains is really with the small businesses. There's a lot of education that's needed. There's a lot of support that's needed. Often these businesses are 5 people, 10 people, the small farms trying to make ends meet, working really long hours. And now we're asking them to report on decarbonization data and employing these decarbonization practices, which very often actually for them have a payback of 7-8 years. And so how do you partner along the big giants in a supply chain, which is consumer companies, wholesale companies, logistics, food processors, to take an example from the food systems, and banks, to make sure that we're addressing this vulnerable points in the supply chain and helping with the economics where it hurts the most and where it's the least manageable. I think that's going to be a very important part of that equation.
I mean, I'd like to hear a little bit from Nick on this, but I do want to point out that there are examples of progress as well. This is obviously a challenge you point out. A company not represented on this panel, but recently announced some progress was Walmart, the world's largest retailer, one of the world's largest companies, on working on the sustainability of supply chains. They announced quite early on working with their suppliers to help them improve, including Scope 3 emissions, including things like vendor financing, providing lower cost of capital for upgrading and decarbonizing their supply chains, including going to their smaller suppliers who might not have the knowledge or the systems or access to capital. Again, it's especially where I come from in America, it's easy to demonize Walmart, but actually when you look and see on climate what they've been doing, there is progress, and they achieved it several years before they said they would. That's the other point they just recently announced. Yeah. So it is possible to imagine some sort of benefits of collective action or a first mover action in this area.
That's an excellent example. They partnered actually with HSBC, so that's one of those good examples of collaboration, and it's just to get the suppliers out of that first 3-4 years of economic valley and get them out of there, and then you can start to really see the benefits of decarbonization, and then it walks by itself.
Right. I'll come to you, Nick. There's a related question. What's your advice for smaller mid-cap companies, mid-market companies on influencing change in supply chain around carbon and water reduction, if you had any thoughts?
Two thoughts. The first thought is the idea of being a catalyst. So if you take the 2 examples I gave earlier on agriculture, 2 extremes. In the US, the Tratera program allowed a catalyst to create a USDA program for grants into agriculture. So, through the program that we created with them, they accessed close to $100 million worth of grants to fund agronomists to go out and improve and work with farmers, etc. Now, that's at one extreme. The other extreme would be take that example from China and say, can we use that catalyst to get government money in an organized way into agriculture and a public-private partnership? As a kind of small, medium-sized UK-listed company, we're going to have to find ways of catalyzing this rather than just being a lead actor. So that's one angle. The second angle would be, how do you engage your customers in this? So we sit right between agriculture and big food. Big food, to be credible into the future, and to be a sustainable enterprise in 10 to 20 years' time, is going to have to demonstrate their sustainability credentials with real facts. And that's likely to be things like product carbon labeling. So how can you access that might of funding to fund back into the system to prove out the end-to-end improvement in the supply chain that flows private money into the initiatives as well, money that we can't afford to invest ourselves because we're not big enough to do that, but we can act as a catalyst by driving different types of partnerships and thinking about the role that we can play in providing the information flow to make that happen.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the question of sort of affordability and cost. You're at the bleeding edge of this, so you see both big food on one side, and as well as facing the farmers on the other. One of the questions asks, are you able to pay higher prices to farmers who deliver lower carbon raw materials? Are you able to have the margins to be able to pass it on, or is that something that, because you're caught in this squeeze, that perhaps it's not coming from your pockets, you're not able to do it?
If we can provide the right kind of information for our customers, it gives us a better chance of doing that. If we can provide them with the credentials to demonstrate they're reducing their carbon footprint, and we can make the farming more efficient, not just more regenerative, we've got a chance of making that system work. Now, that could happen at a lag, and you have to make some choices about where you invest, but it is possible if you get it right.
I want to talk about innovation a little bit. Some of the questions talk about technologies that don't exist, that need to scale. And we've talked about different technology options and fuels as we think about the future. Let's remember the energy system. Whatever the aspirations for decarbonization are, which is to get to net zero, the topic of our panel, we're starting with an energy system where today, 80% of primary energy is fossil fuels. Roughly the same ratio it was 30 years ago. Now, of course, the pie is much bigger. Almost all of that growth has come from low-carbon fuels, mostly renewables, especially solar. Extraordinary transformation in the economics of renewables, which is very good news for those of us who want to see a rapid acceleration of decarbonization. But we have to understand both the stock and the flow, and there's a difference. 80% of the current energy system is fossil fuels, but there's a range of new technologies. And you heard Bill Gates talk about in our opening video that we need probably half a dozen or more. His investment in deep, long-term technologies extends to dozens of potential breakthroughs like small modular reactors or hydrogen of the natural kind that comes out of the earth, so-called white hydrogen. Things that are very unlikely to happen, but which could change everything if they were to happen. How do we think about, maybe Ariel, I'll come to you on this, when we think about financing and being good, prudent stewards of government cash or of World Bank or Development Bank money, you wanted to use innovative hybrid instruments. Do we stick with what we know? Just scale up wind and solar, maybe a little bit of batteries. That's one school of thought, right? The advocates behind the Green New Deal. Professor Jacobson at Stanford is one of the great thinkers on this. He says, innovation is a scam. It's misleading you. It's a shiny object. It's keeping us from doing what we know now. Just do wind and solar and scale it up, throw some batteries in there, and you'll be able to get there. We just need to do a lot more of it. Or are you in the Bill Gates camp that talks about we need to have fundamental breakthroughs in a number of areas if we're going to achieve those long-term goals? Which is the better way to steward the resources of taxpayers?
Yeah, so I would probably be in the Bill Gates camp. I think we need a dual track. The technologies that we know have experienced massive growth. And I think actually the people that were the early movers in investing in those technologies, that was also commercially attractive for them. So I think that also it's not only good for the transition, but it also pays off. So it's a commercially attractive investment. But I do think that we need to walk on a dual track where we create funds, and there are some very good examples in the market where banks, for example, partner up with other kind of MDBs, government money, to create a fund that has different return expectations. Breakthrough Energy is one of those examples. Different risk return expectations, but to make sure that we're catalyzing innovation. I think that's going to be absolutely crucial because there's very little time left. We need to accelerate. We talked a lot about acceleration. And so just doing what we know is probably not going to be enough. It's going to be very important to supplement that with new innovation.
How do you feel about that? Someone who's got a dog in this fight. What do you think about the newer technologies?
Well, I think if you look at the race to net zero, I think there's a tremendous focus on electrification. But I think the reality is electrification on its own is probably not going to meet all of our energy needs. And I'm talking here specifically coming from the energy perspective. Take heat, for instance. In the world, heat is more than half of the global need for energy. And
this is often in industrial heat we're talking about, particularly.
Industrial heat, but also domestic heat. It's space heating, but also cooking. So everything where you need a thermal energy in a thermal source rather than for electronics and the like. Only 10% of that sector right now is renewable, and the heat demand in the world is growing faster than the renewable supply that can meet it. So the position that we take is we see a world which is both electrons and molecules in the long term. Mm-hmm. So it's not a world where electricity will take over everything. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Look at critical resources. To take to make 1 meter of power cable for offshore wind requires 50 kilograms of copper. We just simply do not have enough copper on the planet to make all of the world electric in this way. So we need a multi-tech approach, and we do need to look at zero carbon molecules. So I absolutely support the transition away from fossil, but it does need to be a transition. It's not going to be something which happens overnight. And always in my mind, I have the 3.7 million people who are dying every year while we look for solutions. So as far as our sector is concerned, we had an innovation summit a couple of weeks ago in Washington. We were looking at the small I, which is the small innovation, and the big I. And there's a lot of investment going into small I.
Can you briefly define the difference?
So small I is going to be improving, investments in the distribution infrastructure to bring the costs down to consumers.
So incremental innovation.
Incremental innovation, small-scale innovation, but basically building off what we have already. And the big I is the breakthrough innovation that comes from somewhere else. And really, that's what we need. And we're trying to incubate that, to catalyze that. As an example, one piece of work we're doing in South America is taking the excess they have of wind, of wind and also solar. There's no market for the electricity in the south part of Latin America. So what they're doing is creating green hydrogen.
Right.
Fantastic, and they can do it at relatively low cost, about $1 per kilo. But there's no market for the hydrogen, and to transport the hydrogen to the markets where it's needed is just not going to be cost competitive. So what we're doing is taking, and it was mentioned, I think, by the keynote speaker, that we can't yet take CO2 out of the air. We can take CO2 out of the air.
Sure.
If we
carbon
can take
capture.
Carbon capture, well, carbon sequestration, taken out of the air, not carbon being stored underground, but taking carbon out of the air, combining it with the green hydrogen that we get from the excess of renewable capacity, and creating molecules which are truly circular. So these are the kind of big I's.
Sustainable jet fuel or other uses, it's already being done.
For instance, it's already being done for sustainable jet fuel. What we need to do is make sure that the costs of those processes come down. And in order to do that, it comes back to your early question about partnership. Industry alone is not going to be able to do this.
Right.
We need to have a systemic approach where governments and industry work together in order to provide the right kind of incentives, but I would say also penalties. We need the carrot and the stick approach in order to get there.
Your anecdote about Chile and green hydrogen, hydrogen is a topic I read a lot about for us at The Economist, raises a question about what a net zero world would look like. There are areas that will prosper because they have access to phenomenal renewable resources. South America with the wind in Patagonia, we can imagine solar in Arabia and North Africa. There are parts of the world that are blessed. Of course, maybe offshore wind in the North Sea. There are areas of extraordinary potential, very low cost. We could harness that energy, but they typically are not close to use, not close to industrial clusters or cities. And there is the argument that is now being made by some that rather than shipping the fuel, in this case hydrogen or some derivative fuel, methanol or ammonia, at great expense and energy penalty and loss to a place like Germany, that German industry should more likely move there. That is, steel plants would move to where the clean energy is. And we might see a deindustrialization of some parts of the world, or at least a shift in the way that the map of industrial economy works in future. That fills some people with dread, and other people say it was ever thus. Right? Before China's rise, China didn't make the world's goods, and there was a time in which the circumstances came together, and now that time has passed. The pendulum is shifting in a different direction. I'm curious what people think about, the industrial map of the future and what it means for jobs, for politics, for a backlash in local politics. If we begin to see what might be environmentally beneficial, what might make economic sense to have the world of economic growth, of all both the wants and needs that we talked about with our keynote speaker, but where there's a different economic geography of the future. Harry, since you think about financial topics, maybe you can give it a stab. What do you think? Which is the more likely outcome?
Well, I think there's going to be some reconfiguration. This is the largest transition we have ever undergone, and we have to go through this all together. I mean, this is the largest scale collaboration, if you want to see it that way, that's ever going to happen. And that
the original Industrial Revolution was big too, right?
Yes, but indeed, but this requires collaboration at such a large scale. I mean, all countries, like we can't leave behind Malaysia, we can't leave behind Vietnam, we can't leave behind Chile. So all of this is going to happen at a planetary scale, and we have to collaborate, governments on that level, governments, private sector, financial institutions, individuals, and then across countries. So I think the scale of change that's needed for this transition is probably the largest we've ever seen. And I think that's going to require some reconfiguration of how things are done. I think the technology that we use today is clearly polluting, is clearly creating a debt to nature and a debt to land. And so in order to change that, we will have to use different technologies, and they will be probably located in different places, be generated in a different way, and require different forms of innovative capital to fuel them. So I do think that a net zero world will have a different reconfiguration. And as far as capital is concerned, capital will flow where it makes sense for it to flow and where you get the best risk and return. If we can price that debt that we're creating in, I think that is going to naturally reconfigure things in order to account for that.
How do you see the economic geography of the future?
The logical extension to that point is you'll increasingly see migration of people to where wealth's created. So the point about we're not going to create a more impoverished world through doing this, and therefore we're going to see a combination of migration of capital, migration of people to create a more affluent world and create a more sustainable world. Those two things will have to go together, and in some ways that's probably the biggest challenge that the regulatory system faces across the world. How do you organize yourself in a way that allows that to happen versus at the moment what we're actually seeing is a polarization of the globe. We're seeing a deglobalization,
right,
and a limitation of movement of capital and people in a world that needs it more than ever.
That's actually maybe a powerful note to bring our session to a close on. We are living through, as you rightly point out, an era of, if not deglobalization, what the Economist has put on our covers, slowbalization, right? The trends of the last 30, 40 years are very much in reverse. We see industrial policy on the rise around the world, certainly most notably in the United States, which had historically had more of a laissez-faire approach, whereas Europe, of course, had lots of industrial policy over the decades. The US also heading that way with the IRA, climate law, and the infrastructure laws, much more protectionism, as well as affecting some of the other investment policies. And we're seeing a backlash against the flow of people, just at a time when we're going to see more climate refugees. Tragically, perhaps rising exponentially, we are seeing a xenophobic backlash in many Western societies to immigration, that being harnessed by politicians. And so these trends cannot possibly be consistent with that view that, at least on this panel, we share of a world that moves more ambitiously in a coordinated fashion with equity in mind towards that net zero goal. It may very well call for a broader movement of sustainable energy goods so that the world achieves climate goals at a more economic fashion. Higher priced clean energy products to make clean energy in your country make no sense if we want to achieve climate goals faster, right? And so the pendulum may have to swing before we begin to make that more accelerated progress. So maybe with that note for us to think about for the future, I will ask my audience to thank our panelists for providing us such a wonderful intervention. Thank you.